right. Lecture on Thomas Aquinas. A little bit of historical context. Um, so Thomas Aquinas is about 100 years after the Christian Crusades. The Christian Crusades is when England, France, and Spain failed several times to invade the Muslim-controlled Holy Land, um, the land that we've in other lectures referred to as Judea, um, and today is referred to as Israel and Palestine. Um, the reason that the Christians from those European countries went there was because they were trying to restore the land of Jesus to Christians, um, and um, because they didn't want to leave it in the control of the Muslims, who they felt did not deserve the Holy Land. Um, it's not clear to what extent they understood Islam. Um, you know, Islam does recognize Jesus as a prophet, which is more than what the Jewish people do. Um, but they don't recognize Jesus as God made flesh, so that might have been where the problem was, right? Um, in any case, the Catholic armies from England, France, and Spain went over there about 9 or 10 times. There were about 9 or 10 different crusades, and almost all of them failed. And the veterans and the pilgrims came back. They had to return to Europe because they were expelled by the Muslim armies. But when they came back with many books from antiquity that had formerly been lost to Europe due to like wars and fires and the Dark Ages and just time, right? Like things decay, things fall apart, and so um, when they got to the Middle East, they realized that the Middle Eastern people, right, the Arabs and the Palestinians and the Syrians and the Egyptians have always valued learning and knowledge, and so they did a much better job than Europe did at preserving the texts of antiquity, right? The books of Plato, the books of Aristotle, the books of Marcus Aurelius, the books of Epictetus, and other thinkers. In fact, the only reason we have access to them now is because of the people of the Middle East. And so, when the Europeans came back, they came back with their own copies of all these types of books. Um, so, why is that important? Well, that's important because by 100 years later, when Aquinas is writing, he's been exposed to Aristotle and Plato and these other thinkers, right? So, as we see in the next bullet, Aquinas is writing what we call medieval theology, based in the Roman Catholicism that dominated Western Europe at the time. But he's also influenced by ancient Greeks and ancient Roman texts, and he's also influenced by Islamic works of philosophy as well. In fact, he's often reacting to them and kind of in conversation with these other texts. In particular, not only was Aquinas influenced by Jesus because he's a Catholic, but also in particular by Aristotle. Um, when you read Aquinas, there's a lot of times when he says the master wrote this, and then he puts a quote in there. In this, ironically enough, the master is not Jesus. Jesus never wrote anything, just like Socrates did. Um, Instead, the master is a reference to Aristotle himself. So, the same way that Augustine followed Plato in many ways, Aquinas follows Aristotle in many ways as well. And for those of you that are reading the primary texts, um, if you read Aristotle's dry, kind of very kind of almost technical sounding, scientific jargon way of writing, you'll see that Aquinas does the same thing, right? He has that same kind of dry, uh, highly technical form of writing as well. So we're going to look at two texts very briefly. The first one is called the Summa Theologica, and the Summa Theologica is, I mean, I've seen some hardback editions that are about 126 volumes, each one about that thick, um, and basically Aquinas is explaining everything under the sun, right? He's explaining God and angels and heaven and hell and earth and animals and human beings, etc. Um, and one of the things that's most famous about the Summa Theologica is that um, Aquinas creates what are called the five ways, which are five proofs for God's existence. Right? I'm not going to go through all five of them, but I'm going to go through, two that I kind of like, the two that I like the most. The first one is called the cosmological argument, and the cosmological argument is actually plagiarized by Aquinas from Aristotle's book, The Metaphysics. So this is actually Aristotle's argument, but Aquinas uses it. In the cosmological argument, the first step is to admit that every event or thing in the universe is preceded by one or more causes of its existence. I am here because my mother and my father fell in love and they had sex, and the right sperm hit the right egg cell at the right moment with the right temperature to create me, and I was born, right? So there's like a number of things that have to happen that cause my existence, and that's true for everything else in the universe. Everything is preceded by a number of causes that led to the creation and existence of that event or that thing, right? Pretty straightforward. I don't think anybody is going to disagree with that. Next bullet. These causes are preceded by causes of their own, which are preceded by causes of their own, and so on. You can keep going back in time to a cause before it, and a cause before it, and a cause before it. Again, we all understand that. No big deal. However, notice the next one. Aquinas and Aristotle both argue that there cannot be an infinite regress. There had to be a beginning. You can't just go backwards and backwards and backwards and backwards and backwards and backwards forever, right? There had to have been a first cause of everything else that was not caused by anything before it. And for Aquinas and Aristotle, that first cause, the first mover, is God, right? Even if you were a scientist in NASA and you came up with the Big Bang Theory, and you came in and you said, hey, Aquinas, um, we know that the universe started with the Big Bang, and what caused the Big Bang was a singularity, this kind of ball of everything kind of squeezing in on itself in the middle of nothing until it hit critical mass and it exploded, and then it caused, energy that then eventually became ice and gas and stars and planets. Aquinas would say, well, okay, but what created the singularity? Why is the singularity there in the middle of nothingness? Why is there something instead of nothing? Right? And for Aquinas, the answer is God. Right? God created the singularity that then led to the Big Bang. Next argument. This argument is called the teleological argument. Right? Telos means the end, right? Not as in like the end of the world or the end of the universe, but as in like the purpose for why you're doing the goal, right? In this teleological argument, Aquinas argues, and this one is Aquinas's. He didn't plagiarize this from anyone else that I know of. Aquinas argues that when there's no mind present, right? There's no mind present. One finds chaos. And I put two pictures there next to it. One is just a bunch of twigs. The other one's a nest, also made of twigs. And the point that Aquinas is making is that when you see twigs in a circle wrapped around to create a nest, you know that there was a mind that literally put the twigs in that order to create the nest, the mind of a bird, right? And when there's no mind responsible, when things just fall where they fall, there's the twigs on the floor on the left picture, right? So one finds chaos and disorder when there is no mind. When there is a mind, there is purpose and order and reason and beauty, according to Aquinas. So, the universe is ruled by complex order. Everything serves a purpose. There is no waste in the universe, right? Things die, they feed bacteria. Those bacteria become nutrients in the soil that then become, absorbed by plants, which then feeds herbivores, who then become flesh and meat for carnivores. And then those carnivores die and get absorbed back into proteins and nutrients by bacteria and paramecium and etc. So the point that Aquinas would make is like everything in the universe serves a purpose. Nothing goes to waste, right? And nature inspires artists with its endless beauty. How many landscapes have been created, right? Um, how many? Think of Monet, right, with the lily pads, or think of the Starry Night by Van Gogh. So, there's nothing. There's order and purpose and beauty in the universe, and I gave you two examples, right? The one on the left is an example of, galactic, like galaxies, right, and star systems in space, and neurons, right? Neurons are the network of cells that create the central nervous system in your brain, right? And notice they both look very similar to each other. And then on the right, you have the spiral, right? The spiral gives us, um, you know, uh, hurricanes and tornadoes and galaxies, right? And snails and other shells, right? We find the same kind of repeating pattern again and again and again, right? And so I'm just bringing this up as kind of evidence to kind of back up what Aquinas is saying here about order and beauty. So the last step, if this is the case, there must be a universal mind behind the universe, right? The same way that there's a bird mind behind the nest, there has to be a God mind behind the universe, because it's not a mess, it's not chaos, it's not disorder, it's not random, it's purposeful, it's elegant, it's beautiful, right? And so that's the teleological argument, right? For Aquinas, the order and beauty and symmetry of the universe proves there has to be a God behind it. Now, those are only two arguments for God's existence. There's three more. I did provide some other videos from other professors that you can look at if you're interested in looking at the other arguments. Okay? Moving on to another book for Aquinas. Right? Aquinas has a book called Summa Contra Gentiles. Right? This is a book where he's responding to Muslims and Jews and atheists and other ways of thinking. Right? And one of the things that people bring up is how faith and reason are in conflict and opposed, right? You have people, even here in America politically, you have people who argue that they're on the side of reason and science and medicine and technology, and then you have people who argue in another political party that they're all about faith and God and values, and that these two are against each other. We saw that during COVID. A lot of people kind of fighting back and forth between these two sides. Aquinas is here to tell both sides that this is not the case. Reason and faith are not opposed to each other. According to Aquinas, faith arrives at knowledge of God by God's actions and speech in Scripture, right? You get to know who God is by looking at what God's done and what God said in the Bible or the Quran or the Torah or whatever scripture your religion worships. On the other hand, Aquinas argues, reason also arrives at knowledge of God, but instead of through scripture and choices and words, instead through God's work in the construction of the universe and all life in it, right? So the point is that like you use reason to study the universe to get to know God, the same way that art critics try to get to know the artist by looking at the paintings and the sculptures, and the plays and the songs, right? The same way that you get to know how the mind of artists works by looking at the artist pieces that they've created and analyzing those, you know, rational, natural philosophers can try to understand the mind of God by studying nature itself, right? So notice reason and faith take two different paths, but they end up at the same place, which is trying to understand God through different roads. However, one of the things that Aquinas points out is that the path of faith by itself, right, faith with no reason, can lead to fanaticism because of false prophets and false teachers and false religious leaders, right? Um, so if you have faith but no reason, this is why it's easy for you to be fooled by people who are good at quoting the Bible. Right? And then they make you do things that betray your own faith, like hating and judging and persecuting and trying to get people in jail or get them killed. Right? However, Aquinas points out that the path of reason by itself without faith can lead to nihilism, the belief in nothing, the belief in no God, the belief in no soul, the belief in no afterlife, the belief in no morality, the belief in no right or wrong, right? Because of the arrogance of an intelligence that has limits and that lacks certain understandings, right? So notice both paths, right? If you follow faith by itself, it can lead to problems. If you follow reason by itself, it can lead to problems. Therefore, Aquinas' conclusion is that the path of faith must complement the path of reason, that you have to walk both. You need to study science and reason and logic the same way you need to study scripture and faith together so that you can have a complete human being that is both soul and mind, faith and reason, compassion and love and humility and service with intelligence, right? And knowledge and wisdom. For Aquinas, there is no other way to God but to walk both paths. Do with that as you will. This kind of ends a rather short lecture. There is a lot more to study in Aquinas, but these are just some of the ideas that I find a little bit more interesting than some of the others. So this one will be cut a little bit short. Um, this is it for the medieval period. Some of you may wonder, why is the medieval period so short? Because it was mostly just monks talking about God and religion and angels and free will and heaven and hell and stuff like that. And so, you know, eh, it gets repetitive after a while. It's about 1,000 years of the same thing with monks writing book after book after book, almost always in Latin, talking about the same thing. So I decided to cut this one short so that I could spend more time in antiquity. You saw that that one was longer, and spend more time in modernity. As you'll see, that one is going to be longer too. So after this lecture, go ahead and start taking your notes, study, get ready for the test, because it's going to be a test on Augustine and Aquinas for you for the medieval unit in the module, right? And once you pass that test, then you'll be ready to go into the modern era, which gets into the good stuff. All right? We'll talk about that in the next lecture. Take care.